Today we're going to look at trauma in the developing brain, specifically implications of trauma for learning and therapeutic strategies. By the end of this, you should be able to name 2 implications of traumatic stress for learning, particularly in younger children, and identify at least 2 therapeutic strategies to promote resilience in response to these effects. It helps to remember that threat activates a stress response that starts in the brainstem, well below any kind of cognitive control, so it can't be controlled by willpower. Furthermore, the threat hijacks the frontal cortex and prevents executive functions like learning from happening. This repetition of threat can create a use-dependent change in the brain if it happens frequently enough, and it will eventually reset the brain so that there's a chronic fight, flight, freeze response that happens all the time, almost regardless of context. It's helpful to remember that a fearful brain is physiologically incapable of learning, period. The principle of use dependence is very important, and it's important to remember that just as trauma can create a use-dependent change in the brain, repeated agency and experiences of resilience can also create use-dependent changes in the brain. The way to create agency requires dismantling the trauma response, and the way to do that is to introduce patterns, repetition of patterns, and use those patterns and repetition to activate the lower neural systems first. By lower neural systems, I'm referring to the limbic system and emotions and the physiological system in the brainstem, just basic physiological regulation, breathing, groundedness, lower blood pressure, balance, all of those kinds of things. And then in addition to that, the peacefulness, equanimity, calmness that prepares the brain to learn. So you need to provide grounding, provide security, and provide hope for youngsters in the classroom who are having a tough time learning. Regulated lower neural networks lead to regulated higher neural systems. Early trauma is profound because children are creating templates for expectations. A traumatized child is asking and getting answers to questions like, is the world safe? Are others trustworthy? Do others provide safety and care? Am I okay? Do I belong? Do I have agency? Am I safe? A child is creating mental maps of the world and his or her place in it all the time, and trauma disrupts the way those maps are made, and it disrupts the child's expectations for other adults, other contexts, other places throughout his or her life. Traumatic stress disrupts all of these 8 different domains. It's important to remember that when you're encountering a child who has difficulty in any of these domains, the chances are good the child simply hasn't learned the skills of how to cope with these things. And there is an indication, not always, but there is an indication that there may be traumatic stress in the child's background. There has been 40 years of findings in developmental neurobiology published over and over again, but clinical professions, helping professions working with human beings still have not incorporated these implications into things like pedagogy, clinical practice, programs, public policy. These things are still really lagging. The Marshall-Volt certificate does incorporate and integrate these implications into our pedagogy and practice. And the graduates of Marshall's Volt certificate are charged with integrating these implications into programs and public policy out in their fields, out in the world. The more people we have who are trauma-informed, the more we can advocate for stronger programs, more trauma-informed programs, and more trauma-informed public policy. Okay, when we talk about therapeutic strategies, what is it that we're talking about? Meet the child right where she is. Don't expect more at the beginning than what she's able to deliver. Meet her right where she is and start there. If a cognitive approach is available, then work on cognitive skills. If a cognitive approach is not available, then ratchet it down to the next lower level and work on emotional regulation. And even if emotional regulation is not available, and it may not be, depending on the number and types and intensity of traumatic stress a child has in her background, then work on physiological regulation. And physiological regulation involves patterns, calmness, repetition, and helping the child just get a sense of what it feels like to be in a body and be safe in an environment. The sequence is the sequence in which trauma is addressed matters. The more the therapeutic process can replicate normal sequential neurological development, then the more effective any intervention is going to be. In other words, start with the lowest brain functions and then move sequentially up the brain as improvements are seen and solidified in a child's behavior. Interventions should be patterned, repetitive, somatosensory, using the body and the senses, using those activities which provide brain areas with patterned neural activation needed for reorganization. Examples include things like music, movement, yoga, breathing, drumming even therapeutic massage, although that may be outside the range of what a profession is supposed to do, but a child getting therapeutic massage would really benefit from that. Things like brain gym. If you've never heard of brain gym, you can go on YouTube and search brain gym, GYM, and see those kinds of things that are done. It's basically movement patterns that cross the midline of the body and the corpus callosum in the brain, and it helps to integrate the two hemispheres of the brain. Once activities like these are created, they can create self-regulation and the ability to attend and be more present. Then move on to more relational and experiential modalities like play therapy or art therapy. And then once these activities are solidified, these create appropriate relational responsiveness, and then you can move on to cognitive interventions. The sequence matters. You need to match the therapy to the neurological needs of the youngsters. Encourage young children abundantly. Again, this has to do with how do you deploy therapeutic strategies. Engage abundant encouragement. Use a soft tone of voice when you're talking with a youngster. Use slow speech and movements. The faster you speak and the faster you move, the more likely the youngster is going to just lock up and not be able to hoist on board what you're trying to say. Embody a tranquil confidence in the child and a relentless trust in the process that they are going to get this, that they are going to get better, that learning will happen. And then engage in a relentless trust in the child. Teach the child to tolerate frustration. Just simply say, let's try again, let's try another way. And reframe frustration and failure as indication that the child is learning because the child is outside his or her comfort zone. That's where learning takes place, is just outside that proximal zone of comfort. Keep a long-term mindset and use short-term, intermediate, and immediate goals so that the child experiences success. And do this, repeat, do this, repeat, do this, repeat, and celebrate successive approximations. Yes, well done. Excellent. I knew you could do it. And then use a Goldilocks level of intensity. Not too much, not too little. And you have to base that on the child and just picking up on the child's cues of whether they're getting too frustrated or not. Context. Keep in mind that if you're sending a child to therapy, 1 therapeutic hour per week is not going to be enough. 1 hour in the classroom is not going to be enough. 1 hour with some extra speech therapy, etc., that's not going to be enough. All of the adults working with a child need to consider the child's larger contexts. For instance, if a child goes home to a chaotic or threatening or impoverished or humiliating home life, then you cannot do effective therapy or effective teaching in the context of this larger experience for the child. You have to engage the whole family. Try and find a supportive family member and educate, train, and support that family member, and understand that that family member may also have a trauma history. It's quite likely. So help the family member to reframe their experience, and then to say and believe the cycle of trauma stops with me. I will not pass this on to my children. My child will have a different future. If you can support the family member, then the family member can in turn support the child outside the learning context, and that will solidify gains for the child. Your priorities in providing a therapeutic learning experience would be providing positive experiences in sufficient quantity and in patterns of activity that engage all 5 senses as much as possible, and then engage movement. The more we can engage movement in the learning process, the more children are going to be able to integrate memories and hoist on board the learning. Target lower neural networks in order to activate higher neural networks. Physical movement will lead to clearer speech and clearer ability to attend. Physical security leads to emotional regulation, and emotional regulation leads to cognitive receptivity. If you target the higher neural networks at a sequence, then you're wasting your time and you're wasting the child's time as well. You really have to slow down and help the child to feel safe, secure, that they belong, and that you have trust in them and in their future in order for true learning and consolidation of learning to take place. Okay, you've absorbed an awful lot of information, and some of this information is challenging and may even feel like, oh, this is too much, this is too many different things to hoist on board. I just want to reassure you as well. Developmental trauma is incredibly serious, and we have to give it its due and treat it with due diligence. Developmental trauma does beget years of turmoil and disruption, and it can create a pipeline to prison if the trauma is invasive enough and pervasive enough. A youngster can become so dysregulated that they just end up in trouble over and over and over again, and is in sort of an adversarial relationship with the whole world, and that's what creates the pipeline to prison. But it doesn't have to be that way. If there's one adult in a child's life who believes in the child and believes in the child's future, it can truly, truly turn the tide. I recognize that we won't recognize all trauma in all children. Some children are going to go under the radar, and we're not going to see what's going on. We're not going to recognize it for what it is. And unfortunately, we cannot prevent all trauma from happening, and we cannot save all children. That's the sad reality. But if we can catch or prevent or counteract or heal or nurture any of the traumatized children we can find, we will make a difference for many, if not most, of these children. And every child we make a difference for, it changes their future, and it changes the future for all the people that they interact with in their futures. So take a deep breath and understand you are part of the solution, and that's a good place to be. These are the references I used to pull together this lecture. If you want to read them, you are more than welcome to look at the original sources. And as always, if you have a question or want to discuss this with me, you can call me or email me. We can Zoom, whatever it is that you want to do. I'm here to help you learn about this and to do whatever I can to support you. Thanks for listening.